So I think everyone can agree that getting away with murder is a lot easier when you're killing fictional characters in your story. Now, it's no secret that killing your precious protagonist progeny can be difficult, costly, and necessary in working your book in the direction that you want it to go, but there's a whole other question that very few stories even attempt to answer. How do you kill off your main character, your one protagonist? Spoilers for Vikings and a Game of Thrones ahead. So in the TV show Vikings, Ragnar Lothbrok gets himself captured and killed in a pit of snakes at the hands of Pudgy McNeckbeard and expert misogynist King Aela of Northumbria. In a similar fashion, Ned Stark gets captured and killed by removal of one's head at the hands of the kid who used to torture ants at school, King Joffrey I'm Totally a Baratheon. But before we can continue, we should probably touch on what a protagonist is. Well, he or she is the guy or the girl that for the most part has been the driver of your story, either by their decisions or by their importance because of who or what they are. So Harry Potter is kind of an example of both. He's the focus of the story because of what he is, the baby who defeated Voldemort, but he's also the protagonist because he makes decisions that drive the plot forward. He's the one who says, "Hey, you see that dark and mysterious place that we've been warned against going to? That's where I want to be." There might be other characters making decisions around them, but those characters and their roles are often contingent on the existence or the decisions of that protagonist. George R. R. Martin's Ned Stark is a great example of this. There are other main characters around him at the start of the story: Sansa, Arya, Bran, Jon, even Robb. Boy, these people like to breed. But even though they have their own chapters, their own storylines, much of their role is defined, at least at the beginning, by the decisions of their father, Ned Stark, the protagonist. Sansa is made to marry Joffrey, Robb is made to be the Lord of Winterfell, Arya is allowed to train with Syrio, and Bran is, mostly having a great time visiting Comberville. The direction and the focus of the story is also driven by Ned Stark. The major revelations of the mystery at the heart of the story are made by him and him alone, and the crucial decisions in the story are made by him. To go south to become the Hand of the King, to confront Joffrey after the death of Robert, and to threaten Cersei Lannister. Now, books, particularly young adult literature, are rife with characters like these: Harry, Katniss, Beatrice, Clary, but not Bella from Twilight, because she never actually makes a consequential decision throughout the entire story. The story sort of just happens to her, though she is an example of the second type of protagonist who are the protagonist because of who or what they are. But the point is that very few major developments happen in the story without them being present. And you can actually have multiple protagonists, but for the sake of this essay, I'll be referring to them as the one lead character. Killing your protagonist can feel like the whole story is kind of thrown into disarray. The readers will cry out, "What? But somebody has to wear the invulnerable plot armor?" Because killing your protagonist creates what feels like a myriad of problems. How do you continue a story when the CEO of your character board is gone? When you don't have the character that your audience has been rooting for most of the time? It's difficult for the audience to continue being invested in your story when the consequences and the triumphs of a story thus far can be largely attributed to that particular character. Because of this, very few stories actually kill their protagonists, or those that do don't tend to do so until the end so that they don't have to face the consequences. For most writers, this situation is terrifying, but in Vikings and for our resident authorial monster, George R. R. Martin, who I will now refer to only as Grr, this was intentional. Where a lot of authors try to minimize these questions that spring up in the wake of their death as if to hope that their readers do not notice the difference between one Ragnar Lothbrok and no Ragnar Lothbrok, these two stories revel in the loss of their protagonist. The event that disturbs the life of a protagonist and sets their story in motion is known as the inciting incident. It often presents a problem that needs to be solved or puts them in a situation that requires them to act or adapt. In A Game of Thrones, the inciting incident for the story was the death of Jon Arryn. It motivated Ned Stark to go south. But arguably, it's actually the death of Ned Stark that is the inciting incident for the stories of the 7 or so books following. It acts as the inciting incident for Sansa's story, Arya's story, as well as Robb and Catelyn's. In a similar fashion, Ragnar's death is the inciting incident for the arrival of the Great Heathen Army, for the war between Ubbe, Vitzurg, and Ivar, and the war between King Harold and Lagertha. Exploring the consequences of your protagonist dying can not only be really interesting, but is essential to maintaining the realism realism of the story. Using their death as an inciting incident gives the character a presence in the story even after they're gone, and it helps bridge the gap between having the character and not having them in the story. Now of course, with your protag licking the boots of death himself, sometimes it can feel like you need to have someone new or a previously established character step up into the role of that previous protagonist to fill the awkwardly shaped boots per se, but neither of these stories even attempt to do that. No, the agency of the story doesn't shift from one character to another character, but it divests into half a dozen other characters. Now this doesn't mean that killing your protagonist requires hordes of characters like in a Game of Thrones, but it does make it easier. Actually, Vikings has a relatively small cast in comparison. Now one of the reasons that this worked is that people often find it hard to accept new characters filling the roles of a character that left or died. When John Duggett essentially replaced Fox Mulder in The X-Files as male lead who had a family member abducted, but not that kind of abducted, the fans weren't, well, fans. No matter how different the writers tried to make these two characters, it still felt incredibly wrong. I mean, it will very easily turn into your readers screaming, "You're not my real dad," at the new protagonist. But I want to be clear, this isn't an absolute rule when it comes to writing. In the comic book world, it's extremely common for characters to take up the mantle of superheroes before them, and it often works. Wally West succeeding Barry Allen as the Flash is just one example, but there's a good in-world reason for that. The whole taking up the mantle thing works in the comic book scenario because it's integral to the theme of anyone can be a superhero. It could be you, or you. It doesn't feel like the writer is forcing you to accept someone pretending to be the other protagonist that came before them. Readers are pedantic but loyal creatures, and it can still be hard to persuade them to accept these new characters, so it's not a perfect formula. Connor Hawke successfully replaced Oliver Queen as the Green Arrow, but there was still a marked decline in interest in the series after Queen's death. But killing off your protagonist isn't just a matter of exploring the consequences and the follow-through after they die, it's also about how you set up their death as well. Because generally speaking, there's a relatively, and I say relatively because there are plenty of exceptions, reliable formula for making your readers cry. The more time you spend with someone as a character, the more tears you get when they die. And there's nothing wrong with wanting to make your protagonist's death a big moment, but making it so that the entire story leads up to their death, that every plot thread that you write facilitates it, and the story effectively revolves around their role. It presents a very particular problem. When the death of your main character and its consequences are the payoff for the whole story before it, readers are sometimes left asking, well, what is there left for me to care about? You spent all this time leading up to this moment, and what else? Shawarma? Vikings got around this problem pretty cleverly. In a clever way? Whatever. As the story evolved, one of the other main characters, Bjorn, his story of becoming an adventurer became independent of Ragnar Lothbrok as the protagonist, and we were beginning to explore it well before Ragnar's death. Likewise, we became invested in Lagertha's story without it requiring Ragnar, and while Ivar, Uber, Vidserg and Sigurd's stories were all contingent on the death of Ragnar, the show spent a good deal of time beforehand shifting the focus to their feud with Lagertha and the rivalries between them as brothers that set the stage for the remainder of the series. In fact, in the half-season leading up to Ragnar's death, the agency of the series began to shift away from him and into the hands of the other characters. Now, often enough, a main character's death is portrayed as a self-made fate where every event that leads up to it is directly or indirectly controlled by that main character. But in Vikings, the characters who drive the direction of the show at that point are clearly Ivar, Uber, Vidserg, Sigurd, Bjorn, Lagertha and Egbert, not Ragnar. The writers made it so that by the time of Ragnar's death, the viewer already feels that the agency of the show is very much in the hands of characters who will continue. It doesn't feel like a reboot. Time has been spent investing in storylines that are not contingent on Ragnar's role as the protagonist. You could arguably say that this actually removes Ragnar from the position of protagonist. Another good example of this technique was The Mentalist. The story spent its entire first 6 seasons building up two things: Jane's rivalry with Red John and Jane's relationship with Elizabeth. But after the death of Red John, the show didn't actually drop from its 12 million or so viewers per episode. Part of the reason for this, I think, is that the story was not wholly contingent on that rivalry with Red John. It was dependent on the development of that relationship as well. In A Game of Thrones, there were storylines that weren't contingent on Ned Stark's role as the protagonist, most prominently with Daenerys and Jon's storylines. In fact, at the end of the first book, when Jon decides to abandon the Night's Watch in defense of the Starks, he's stopped, and continues with his storyline, as if Gur himself is saying, no, not every story has to be contingent on your protagonist. A smaller but more important detail, I think, in Vikings is that Ragnar died in episode 15 of 24, not at the end of the season. Killing the protagonist partway through your book immediately subverts expectations. In the Game of Thrones book, Ned Stark dies with over 100 pages still to go. Killing your protagonist at the end of a series or a book gives it a sense of finality, while killing them halfway through reinforces to the reader that there is still story to follow and explore. So killing your main character is a complex, difficult, fun, and risky thing to do. Using it as the inciting incident to other stories is a great idea, except when it isn't. And trying to have someone fill the oversized shoes of your protagonist is nearly always going to go badly, except when it won't. And it's not just about the consequences, but more importantly the setup. Moving agency of the story to other characters before their death can be a really effective way of preparing the reader for that death. But that's all from me. Reading and writing are kind of a big thing for me. I've loved, reading books and writing stories and studying stories for pretty much my entire life. I like studying narratives, how people structure it, develop it, and why some books are good or famous and why some aren't. Let me know if you've found any of this helpful, and whether you'd like me to do more of this kind of thing in the future. And if so, what would you like me to talk about? In 2018, I want to evolve my channel to not just include lore and nerdy stuff, but arguably talk about my greatest passion, storytelling. I'm just some guy on the internet, of course, but I wish you the best of days and nights, that your pen writes quickly and your imagination produces the characters you need. Please let me know what you think down below, and if you like the stuff that I make, then please consider supporting me on Patreon. It really does help me make videos and kind of keep going in the life of the poor student. Otherwise, come follow me on Wattpad, Facebook, email, Twitter, or send me stuff you made. The address and links in the description below. Stay nerdy, Subfuries, and I'll see you in the future.